Now it's time to hear from some of the professionals in the community through a panel of speakers. This event is being streamed on the internet right now and will be available later for viewing through the support of NOWCastSA, who is your local public television on the internet. Moderating the panel is someone who you might have picked up on when she told you to turn off your phones and stuff. She's listed as an online instigator as part of her job title, which should make this a really interesting panel discussion. Please join me in welcoming Charlotte-Anne Lucas, Director of NOWCastSA, as the panel moderator.
Thank you so much, Fred. And before I go any further, I also want to thank Valero for hosting this significant event. And I need to give a special shout out to Methodist Healthcare Ministries for providing the underwriting that supported our webcast today. I'm going to introduce the members of the panel, and as I do, would you please join me up here? Thank you. First, Al Philippus, as I used to know him once upon a time, Chief Al Philippus, but he insists to me now that he is at Valero Energy, he is just Al. He will be representing the workforce sector. Also, we have with us Dr. Deborah Healy, Director of Guidance and Counseling Services at Northside Independent School District, and Dr. Healy will be representing the education sector. And we have Dr. Stephen Pliszka. He is the Professor and Chief, yes, this is the long title, Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Texas Health Science Center at San Antonio. And he's going to be representing the medical sector. And we have last, Dr. Jeannie Von Stultz, Director of Mental Health Services at the Bexar County Juvenile Probation. And Dr. Von Stultz will be representing juvenile justice. Okay. So we have some questions that I'd like all members of the panel to answer to help us get underneath this and understand it a bit better. So we'll start with Dr. Healy. What happens when children who need help are not treated?
Thank you, Charlotte-Anne.
Pull it closer.
There's so many potential outcomes when children don't receive mental health services and treatment. Certainly we know that their difficulties and their distress is compounded by the lack of support in the environment. There may be academic failure, a loss of self-confidence, beginning to spend time socially with peer groups that may be gang involvement or criminal activity, hopelessness, frustration, disappointment, and then their trajectory becomes changed. And so the kind of potential that they may have for academic success and for vibrancy and well-being is challenged by the obstacles that they face that may cause youngsters to just shut down. And as we heard from Lisa, may even turn to masking their symptoms with drugs and alcohol, thinking about suicide. And we have children who act out and they're easy to notice, but we have children who act in and they're harder to notice because they become somewhat invisible and may certainly be suffering in silence. So many, many, many negative outcomes and loss of potential.
So what happens in the workplace? What happens in the workplace?
Well, from the workplace perspective in business, and I'm going to take a few liberties here with my former career also, there's a significant impact on costs for businesses today, lost work time for parents, focus upon the type of treatment programs that need to be directed towards the children and specific needs. There's lost time away from work for the parents having to deal with those issues. You know, and I'm going to kind of flip a little bit over to the other side. You know, in my former career, because there's some strong link to that associated with a stigma attached where the criminal justice system in some case has to deal with a situation versus having a diversion program, treatment program available. And unfortunately, the criminal justice system is burdened today and has been for a number of years. But it has a profound impact on the business sector and the workplace today in dealing primarily with providing the treatment for the children, the costs associated with businesses and lost time, especially for the parents.
That's a good segue into Dr. Von Stultz. How does this affect juvenile justice?
Well, I think as the other panelists have mentioned, as children get older, the impact of going untreated or undertreated, the complexities kind of increase exponentially. You have now children who are both struggling internally, but because they turn to options such as negative peers or drugs and alcohol, you have now compounded the problem and made it more difficult to reverse the problem because those issues in themselves create a life of their own that are very hard to get out of. You know, drugs and alcohol in and of itself becomes kind of just a huge resource for those kids, and they see no other option other than that. And so trying to then support a family who now has this child who's disenfranchised or disconnected is incredibly difficult.
So Dr. Pliszka, what happens when children who need help are not treated for the medical profession?
Well, there are really two very serious long-term outcomes. One is that a childhood psychiatric illness then progresses into an adult psychiatric illness, you know, increasing severity, bipolar disorder, psychotic disorders, substance abuse, and that has all kinds of implications in terms of, as Al was suggesting, lost work productivity, people going on to disability, which has huge costs to society, and obviously involvement with the criminal justice system. But also, as Fred was mentioning earlier, the presence of psychiatric illness, depression, bipolar, has also physical consequences, higher rates of a number of different kinds of degenerative diseases, hypertension, asthma, perhaps even things like chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia. There's a real interface between brain disease, psychiatric disease, and other chronic medical illnesses.
It's such a tremendous cost in so many areas. How do you see the stigma that we're trying to address today? How do you see that reflected in your areas?
I talked to parents about how they would intervene if their child had strep throat. What would you do? And nearly everyone says, well, we'd go to the pediatrician. And so I talk about concerns, behavioral concerns or mental illness in the same way. How do you intervene? Where can you go for help and support? And try to normalize and remove the sense of stigma any more than we would have a stigma about treating physical illness.
How about in the workplace?
I think in the workplace, you know, I think businesses in general are going to have to redirect their focus towards the stigma if you have some type of mental health condition or some type of mental illness that you're seeking treatment for that you may not be qualified for a certain position. Now, obviously that affects the adults, but it also carries and transcends over to the children in those particular families. As these children come up and move into the workforce, you know, we have to raise a level of awareness that, you know, if a person is, I think the illustration was given earlier, they had a broken arm that's healed, that there's an opportunity for healing and treatment through excellent psychiatric programs available to children as well as for adults. And I think we need to raise the level of awareness for businesses as well as throughout the entire community and make resources available through businesses, through healthcare programs to provide that necessary treatment.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And how about in the juvenile justice system?
Well, you know, Lisa's story, I think, was a perfect example of what we see. I mean, the impact of stigma, yes, in the community, but I think the most powerful impact is what you see in regards to the thoughts and feelings of the child and the family themselves. You know, first there's that denial that the families just struggle with, and they try to turn and look at, you know, what they're doing wrong or what their child is intentionally doing wrong. And then when families do kind of acknowledge that there is a problem, there's still the apprehension to seek treatment because then that makes it public. And so they struggle with the shame and the embarrassment. And so it progresses to the point where even if families do get treatment, oftentimes we'll see that they're still apprehensive or uncertain about treatment, so they don't follow through with treatment as they should. And so there's inconsistency, and this creates this vicious cycle where the child's not really getting all that they need in order to resolve or manage the issues. And we've even seen it go so far as to families don't know how to manage, so they in turn feel helpless and overwhelmed and are looking for outside agencies to take over. I've seen families so overwhelmed by what's going on with their children, and they don't know how to address it, and overwhelmed by the shame that they want to protect their other children. They're willing to give up that child, and they're willing to find alternative placement for that child or have the state take over custody for that child. So it reaches that level where it breaks the bond between a child and a family, or it breaks the bond between the partners in that household, the adults within the household.
That is so very tragic.
I think all illnesses are some combination of genetic and environmental forces. So you may be at genetic risk for high blood pressure, and but at the same time, your diet, your lifestyle, things like that will interact with that to determine what the outcome is and whether you ultimately have the stroke or something. And we sort of accept the fact that, you know, yes, I have a family history of hypertension, and now I have to take high blood pressure medicine, but I also have to, you know, watch what I eat and so on. In mental illness, though, the assumption is it's all a matter of willpower, that we tend to deny the sort of medical genetic side, or we say, well, it's genetic and therefore there's nothing you can do about it. We don't use the same thinking that it's a combination of things, that certain things like autism, ADHD, bipolar have a very heavy genetic component. You can develop it regardless of how good an environment you're in. Some things like depression, people can have a genetic risk, but if they're fortunate and they don't have any trauma in their life at all, maybe they escape a depressive episode. But if they have a highly stressful event, rather than bouncing back from it, they go into a depressive episode. And so there's a need to use both combinations of medication and psychotherapeutic techniques. But there's stigma, particularly for medical professionals, is the idea that the medicine is either a crutch or it's something that's being used to control people or turn them into zombies, rather than seeing it. No one sees medicine for hypertension or diabetes in that kind of light.
Right, absolutely. Well, I have to remind myself and also the panel that we have, I just checked earlier, we do have an online audience. They're watching us through those cameras, and we should make sure we're looking at that online audience and this wonderful audience in person. So what can the community do to help children and their families receive the care that they need through the education system?
Part of it is building awareness and helping teachers, counselors, parents to know what are some of the indicators of distress in children. What is just typical signs of growing up, and what is something more than that that may be an indicator that there's a need for support. So education and awareness is a key step. We come in a school district from a very strengths-based model, talking about the strengths of youngsters and removing any obstacles that may impede their ability to enjoy and amplify and cultivate their strengths. And so as we do that, parents may feel less of a stigma, because if it is really enhancing their strengths through mental health services, there's more of a buy-in and more of an interest in making that happen. And so the other thing that I think is important is helping connect, forming community partnerships between school districts and mental health agencies and social workers and all those who weave a fabric of support, so that when families turn to us and say, where can we go, we are well equipped to help them know. We have resource fairs, we have resource books and guides where phone numbers are available. We have resource tables in our schools where parents can pick up information and find out where they can go for the support and the help that they need. They may want to tell the school about it, or they may want to keep it a more confidential matter at first as they're navigating how to interact with systems of care. So removing barriers is a very important piece piece to it in helping make those connections, awareness and connections, and then the support from the school staff as children are in counseling, that we are sensitive to that and that we work with classroom teachers and counselors and principals, and so that everyone makes the school environment welcoming to all children.
And what can the business community do?
Well, I agree with my colleague. I mean, I think the key is going to be education and awareness. You know, a united front to deal with this issue, not only in San Antonio, Bexar County, state of Texas, but across the country. You know, we see aggressive campaigns associated with anti-DWI. You see campaigns associated with bullying. I think the more education and awareness you can raise about this issue, the better we can deal with this matter. You know, people sometimes think that, I remember as a patrolman, that domestic violence and all the issues associated with alcohol, depression, drug abuse occur in homes in different parts of the community. It happens across the board. It happens in wealthy families. It happens in poor families. It happens with everybody, and sometimes in the wealthier families it's closed and it's sort of hidden. And so that united front, certainly resources available, funding is critical, but I think there needs to be a united front. I think businesses need to play an active role in that. Companies like Valero, USAA, all of the folks that we have in here in the community that dedicate themselves to many of these campaigns need to provide a united front in helping to support programs like the Clarity. But the education awareness, I say, is critical.
To add to what's already spoken, I think in addition to the education and awareness, I think we really need to, as a community, encourage early identification and treatment. It's really important that the community provide support and education to families to help them meet their children's needs. And I think of most importance, or what's critical, is that we provide that support and education early on in a child's life, where parents can still literally wrap their arms around their children. It's so much more difficult to wrap your arms around a teenager. And at that point, it's almost too late in many ways. So we really need to target that age where the problems, granted, are severe, but are much more manageable, and you know, they can still literally hug their children.
I think certainly one major problem in the psychiatric area is there's a tremendous shortage of psychiatrists in the United States, and this for a variety of reasons. You know, psychiatric care generally is reimbursed less than other specialists, other specialties. So there's perhaps a need for, say, loan forgiveness programs for medical students, so they would consider. I've known medical students said, well, I would consider psychiatry, but you know, cardiology or gastroenterology is just so much more lucrative, and I need to pay off loans, etc. But there's also an interesting way that stigma affects psychiatric care that people don't think about it. I have occasionally had medical students tell me, well, I kind of was interested in psychiatry. It's my favorite class, but I'm not going to be a psychiatrist because my family's opposed to it, because I went to medical school to be a doctor, not to be a shrink. And so the more that there's this sense that the psychiatrists really aren't doing real medicine, that's a very strong sentiment in the public generally, and I think among a fair number. A lot of medical students come into medical school saying, you know, I'm not even going to. Others say, I'm not even thinking about it. That's not what I'm even interested in. And sometimes we can't even get medical students to come to the psychiatry classes, even though as primary care doctors, they're going to be facing this in their offices every day. So this anti-stigma campaign can perhaps, we try to show students and other folks, you know, a lot of the advances in neuroimaging and genetics that may yield new treatments in the future, that it's in fact a very exciting area.
So it takes so many aspects of the community to cooperate to try to address this. Well, getting back to getting at the problem while you can still get your arms around it, which is wonderful, wonderful imagery. Dr. Pliszka, what are some of the causes of mental illness in children?
The causes are multifaceted and vary by disorder. Some of the major mental illnesses, ADHD, schizophrenia, bipolar, up to about 80% of the problem appears to be genetic, and the genetics is extremely complicated, and probably involving hundreds, if not thousands, of genes. So one of the exciting areas right now at NIH's funding is it's now much easier to look at the entire human genome, and they're doing this in all kinds of different disorders, cancer, and so on, because each person may have a series of unique mutations that influences their particular disorder. Now, things like depression, post-traumatic stress syndrome, anxiety disorders, these have a genetic component, but tend to be much more involved in the kinds of stressors you've been exposed to. And for some people, no matter, you can have no genetic risk for a mental disorder whatsoever. If you're exposed to an overwhelming enough stress, you might be vulnerable to develop this. We also know that stress, trauma themselves can have effects on gene expression and brain development. So you can start out not having a gene for any particular disorder, but if you're exposed to something particularly traumatic, that can actually kind of shape brain development in certain ways, so that the arrow sort of goes in both directions. The hope is in another decade or so that psychiatric diagnosis might be based partially on a deeper understanding of the biological roots, and that in turn would lead to very specific treatments. So for people with depression might all get a different medication depending on what their biological subtype would be. But as much as that advances, there's still going to always be a major role for talk therapy and other kinds of psychosocial interventions. And then the final point I would make, I think in the 1960s, we were of the view that nobody needed residential care or state hospital care long term, and state hospitals were emptied, and there's still many people who feel strongly that way. And I think the danger is there's a subgroup of people who probably would benefit from long-term residential care. The alternative being we see youngsters who get admitted, 5, 6, 10 times a year because their illness never really gets under control, and they would do better long-term in a structured setting. And that's very difficult for some people to accept. But I think we have to kind of look at that. Of course, that's also the very expensive part of care in terms of, but again, the long-term benefit, I think would well be worth it.
I think you've almost halfway answered the next question, which is how effective, I mean, when you're talking about this there's a genetic component, but so how effective is treatment for children and adolescents?
I think for the more uncomplicated illnesses, ADHD, depression, post-traumatic stress syndrome, if you have kind of one particular illness, the treatments are extremely effective.
And earlier, better?
The earlier the better, yes. And for people with multiple illnesses, I mean, the treatment at the course is much more stormy, and we often get what's called a partial response. It's definitely better than nothing. But sadly, there are situations where we just reach a certain level of improvement, and I think that's what's most frustrating to families, because, they say there's a sense of, well, is this all there is? Is this what we're going to have to deal with forever? And often the answer is unfortunately yes. And that's where we need more of the research to push to increase the number of treatments that are available.
Dr. Healy, how has NISD responded to the mental health needs of children throughout the district?
In terms of identifying children, we have a process. Thank you. We have a process through federal law that's called response to intervention. And response to intervention is meant to be a very early kind of warning system to help us notice children in distress. And so teachers know that as they see a child who, for whatever reason, is not making the kind of progress their peers are making, or they seem to be struggling, they begin to come together as a community and talk with parents of that child, with the teachers, with the counselor, the social worker, the school psychologist, and begin to put in place some effective practices to address behavioral concerns, emotional concerns. And then they monitor that response to the child, to the intervention, the child's response, and actually graph and chart that response so that they can see how is this helping or not. And that's a multi-tiered level. There are 3 tiers in the response to intervention. And so as they come together to see how children are doing, they may need to refer a child to support in a community mental health agency, or they may need to refer a child for special education services, which would mean that they'd have very individualized education plan that supports the student's learning and academic fitness. So that's one way, and that again is regulated by federal law and is a process called response to intervention. Also, school counselors and school staff talk with parents to identify what children need and help make that phone call, because that sometimes is the hardest step. Parents say, I don't know who to call or how to connect. And so sitting together and making that first outreach phone call to help a child get an appointment for support. School counselors don't function as therapists. So they're there on the front lines to do the psychoeducational piece. They do run groups on campus with a parental consent and do individual counseling with a parental consent. But if a child's need is for family therapy or more intensive psychotherapy, then we work with agencies such as Clarity Child Guidance and others in the community to help them make that bridge and make the connection. And the other thing I would say is that counseling is a process, not an event. And so we try to educate families about the fact that it takes time. And sometimes things may feel a little bit worse before they feel better as people confront the major themes and issues in their lives. And so we encourage families to stick with it, to know that it's a process that's going to evolve over time. And then soon you see the light come back, that light of hope in children's eyes when they know that there are places to turn for help and support. And we certainly are there to also encourage that process. And as a school community, to build a safe and supportive climate so that when children come to school, their teachers, their counselors, their principal, all of our school staff are there to help them realize their potential and enjoy and celebrate their strengths.
I'm learning so much here. What do you think parents know about this? I mean, what's the level of awareness among parents?
It varies, and that's why this campaign is so incredibly important. There are some parents who are highly aware, and others who, as we've heard this morning, may think this is just part of growing up. It's something we need to manage within our family. Don't tell anyone. And so it is incredibly important that we get the word out and that we help to remove stigma and barriers and address children's mental health the same way we would address physical health or anything else that truncates somebody's potential and robs them of the possibility of realizing all their dreams.
What's the impact to business today if a family is struggling with mental illness? I mean, how does business feel it?
The impact primarily on business is associated with difficulties inside the family, which carries over and transcends into the workplace. It's estimated that mental illness, substance abuse, costs American business about $80 to $100 billion a year. That's with a B. There's more lost time from productivity from work associated with stress and anxiety than there is from physical illness or injury. So it's a real challenge that we face in business today, and one that certainly employers and businesses need to address with employee assistance programs, things of that nature. It carries over to if you have physical conditions associated with heart problems or diabetes or things of that nature, can carry over into depression that affects business and production inside the workplace and actually affects the entire atmosphere of the workplace itself. And so, it's a major challenge that we face in business today, making sure that we're providing adequate resources, not only for those families, for the potential for the breakup of those families, providing assistance to those families, but more importantly, ensuring that we have that same level of assistance that's provided to the children, because the parents may be dealing with a child. It may be nothing that certainly is affecting the adult themselves, but it affects the family.
Absolutely. So then that's what's happening right now. What are the future costs if children and adolescents don't receive treatment? Well,
those children are going to grow up and they're going to go into the workplace. And I think the challenge we face, as one of our colleagues said up here, if we don't identify it early on and deal with it at an early stage, if it's ignored to some extent and there is no form of treatment, that individual at some point comes into the workplace and you have all of those issues associated with that. You could have problems with depression. We've seen instances in this country as well as inside of our local community associated with workplace violence, family violence. I mean, it starts early and it carries on into adulthood, and certainly it affects the workplace tremendously today. And so again, is say, well, okay, what are the solutions? I think businesses need to make their employees aware that there are resources available, not only from the company's perspective, but from the community perspective, and they need to be very holistic.
One of the places that some of those resources are available is at oneinfiveminds.org. There are lists, if you look on that website, of all sorts of resources that have been pulled together. Dr. Von Stultz, how does this affect our community and throughout the county?
Well,
the untreated mental illness.
As children progress, and especially for those children that go untreated or undertreated, and that's equally as important as untreated, there's this disconnect. They disconnect from their schools. They disconnect from their friends. They disconnect from their families. And, they even disconnect from themselves. And so what you have is basically the loss of an incredible asset, which I think affects all parts of the community. But you've heard today, several times mentioned involvement in the criminal justice system, and that's not just a minor involvement. What we see in the juvenile justice system is that 30 to 50% of the children that are involved in our system struggle with a serious mental illness. 30 to 50%. So that means 30 to 50% of the individuals that are committing offenses, juvenile offenses, have mental illness. So think about the impact on the community in regards to the victims of those offenses, the victims of the assault, the victims of the thefts, the victims of the criminal mischief, and even the victim of a truancy. I mean, that impacts the school district in regards to the resources that they can bring in for other students because of a truancy case. Think of the impact in regards to the legal system, how much it costs law enforcement to respond to these calls. And oftentimes when I hear from law officers, I mean, those are high maintenance calls. They take a tremendous amount of time, despite our efforts to kind of reduce that time. Think about the impact on the judicial system, the cases that are being heard before the courts, and all that's involved in regards to district attorney fees, defense attorney fees. So then you think about the impact in regards to, let's say the child does get on probation, the cost of intensive home-based services, because at that point, community-based services may not be effective. Or what Dr. Pliszka mentioned, the impact of long-term residential treatment. And the cost of that compared to the cost if we could have just identified that child early on and provided them with care in the community. And so that's the impact that we see in regards to the community.
Dr. Von Stultz, where can people in Bexar County families get help for their kids who are dealing with a mental illness?
I really, I love working in Bexar County for reasons like today. The fact that this community really pulls together to help their children. Even though we have nothing in regards to resources, you've heard our representative speak today about that, this community really steps up. There's a lot of nonprofit organizations. Clarity is a perfect example of doing things that go beyond their scope. We have communities and schools works incredibly hard to help and support children and families in any way they can, literally in the schools. We have St. PJ's that works to provide support services to children oftentimes in the child welfare system or those in underserved communities. We have Family Service Association who works to provide a vast array of resources to people. We have Baptist Child and Family Services. We have Roy Moss Youth Alternatives, organizations in town that work to kind of fill the gaps. We have psychiatric facilities that do a wonderful job in regards to stabilizing children, but returning them home. Clarity again, Nick's Behavioral Health, Laurel Ridge Treatment Center. We also have our local mental health authority who works tremendously hard and year after year provides services to children, more children than they're even allocated based on state funding. And then we have advocacy organizations such as NAMI that work to kind of bring awareness to what is impacting both children and adults in regards to mental health. But the hard part is all of these organizations work so hard, and yet we have a lot of families that aren't able to connect. And it's especially those families that are uninsured or underinsured. And especially those families where it's difficult for them to access resources because of transportation issues, child care issues. You know, they have other children in the home. I can't tell you how many stories I hear of a mom trying to pick up one child from elementary school, one child from daycare, go to middle school to pick up the one that's the one in trouble, then get on a bus to go to an afternoon appointment because you don't want to miss school, still try to get homework done, to feed those children, to get them bathed. I can barely do that, you know, with a car. And so, and these families are trying to do this all on a public transportation system that's decent, but when you're lugging around, you know, 2 or 3 kids going to multiple stops, it's nearly impossible. And so what we see is these resources in the community working to try to fill gaps, but the continuity is not there, and that's not the fault of any of the hardworking agencies, but more of kind of the resources that we have, as a community, have decided we're going to dedicate to children in the state of Texas.
Well, I guess it comes back around to what this campaign is going to accomplish in this community. What's your hope?
As Dr. Von Stultz was talking about, helping to make that coordination. I think one of the key roles that schools can play is helping to coordinate with all those agencies that are out there to provide the support so that children and teenagers aren't suffering in silence, and that there is their needs are met, and that they're met quickly without delay. And so that would certainly be my hope for our community, and it's what we continue to strive to do every day. All the agencies that Dr. Von Stultz mentioned are agencies we work with, that Northside ISD works with very closely, to provide evening events or evening centers where parents can go, or Saturday events, or resource fairs. So many men and women here in Bexar County in their agencies are ready to serve, and helping to build those bridges and assist families, mentor them in crossing those bridges so that there is that support. Because the longer children suffer, the less hope they feel, and the less things feel open to change, because it becomes a lifestyle rather than just a temporary situation. And so that early intervention helps us to turn that and make that change much more quickly, so that children and teenagers set goals, pro-social goals, so that, again, they can enter the business community and have healthy citizenship.
I just remembered one more that's out there, that's the 211, which is also a great resource for people.
Well, I guess I'm hopeful that this campaign will serve kind of as the genesis for that united front that I spoke of earlier, bringing more attention and awareness to this issue inside of our community. Educating parents, but educating just the community at large about what the impact is, not only in the early childhood development stage, but also as people move up in through school, young people, and into the workplace. You know, there's a lot of work to be done associated with this, but, you know, as Dr. Von Stultz said earlier, this community, I can recall dealing with tragic consequences and difficult situations in the police department. I'll tell you, there's no place like San Antonio and Bexar County in able to come together and present a united front. So I view this campaign as an opportunity to kind of serve as that genesis, but I want to see it grow. I'd love to see it grow. I'd love to see it flourish. I'd love to see more opportunities presented to young people as well as for families in our community.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. What's your hope?
Well, I think one step to bringing that awareness is if each of you go back to the agencies that you work with, and to make sure that there is an awareness, that there's, you know, education or training in regards to children's mental health issues. I know that when I go do presentations at various organizations, typically at the end of that presentation, there are 7, 8, 10, 15 parents that want to talk to me about their own child and what's going on with their own child. And these are you know, social organizations, institutions that are intended to help other people. So we, as professionals also have to kind of understand our own personal lives. And so I think that that's important. But I do, like my colleague said, hope that this community just really decides our children come first. And it's time that we do something. And I think just that commitment from the voices in here will have a huge impact.
I would think that to the degree that people can convey to family and friends that mental illnesses are like other medical illnesses, they have a genetic component, that doesn't mean that people, quote, have no control or they're not responsible for themselves. I think this is one of the barriers to breaking down the stigma. If we accept that depression or some episode of aggression behavior is part of a mental illness, then we're somehow saying, well, that person's not responsible and that's not right and so on. And we got to get out of that loop. A person may have a mental disorder that makes it difficult for them to control a given behavior. That doesn't, we can treat that and improve their ability to control that. We're not really taking responsibility away from somebody. And sometimes there are mental illnesses that tragically break down people's insights, particularly in things like schizophrenia. The person loses the ability to be aware that they are ill. I mean, I spoke to some ladies in my church, and they were upset because they'd gone out to kind of help the homeless, and they saw a lady on the street with no socks on, so they gave her some socks, and a few minutes after they walked away, she took the socks off. And they went back and said, well, why'd you take the socks off? He says, well, because when I put them on, I started hearing voices, and I think the socks are trying to control me. And they said to me, well, why doesn't somebody do something about that? Because they tried to get her to say, well, why don't you go to the hospital? Well, no, because the CIA is at the hospital. And and yet if we try to enact laws that say, take that person to the hospital, give them medicine, give them treatment, there's a huge upcry, you're forcing that person you're imprisoning them, et cetera. And I think we've got to break out of that entire mold if we're going to make progress, particularly for some of the seriously mentally ill.
Absolutely. We do have a few minutes if there are some folks in the audience who want to ask some questions of this panel. You can also obviously wait until after it's over and line up in front of them. But any questions you want to ask? I see a person out there. Is there someone with a microphone? It's important that the question go into the microphone so we can hear it on the interwebs.
Does Clarity have plans to have some kind of a speakers bureau so that organizations around San Antonio that would like a presentation to their organization could get a presentation like we're seeing today, maybe on a slightly less exotic scale, without a congressman? But I would think there's a lot of organizations, if we're going to be working on the stigma, it's not going to be one-to-one as much as it's going to be organizations going to spread the word to their area of our community.
Who's the best person to answer that question?
I'm on the board, but I'm not the person.
Is this on? Yeah, it is. Speaking of board, we have a board meeting right after this, so I was out making some of the final arrangements for that, so I didn't even hear the question. I apologize.
What are Clarity's plans for more programs like this and making them accessible throughout the community? I think that's
definitely. We do. We have a number of staff that do that on a very regular basis. So if you need something, call us and we'll see what we can do to get it arranged. We're always looking for volunteer speakers that can help with that as well. So we can do that on top of that. And I have to say, I wish I could tell you everything we had in the works right at the moment, but pay attention over the next 2 or 3 months. You're going to be hearing about a lot of things that Clarity's working on that will help increase access in the community. And anytime you have a question about anything, just please don't hesitate to call us. Yeah.
I'm Rebecca. I had the pleasure of working with Fred on the Clarity team. And last year, we provided 51 visits to organizations and provided education really for free to over 4,500 folks. So we've got a process in place. Can we have more opportunities like this? Absolutely. This is really the start of the campaign. We can do so much more together to eliminate the stigma of children's mental health.
And in the short term, also, don't forget that immediately after this event today, the video from the webcast will be archived and available for replay. So that you can share with your friends as well right now. I think I saw another hand out there.
Just two brief comments and then a question. Dr. Pliszka raised the issue of the illustration of someone from his church, and I'm wondering the role of faith congregations in this campaign as well, since not only in terms of outreach, but of course of members of the congregations and how to support them. A second observation would be the cultural nuances in the campaign that would reach out to the Hispanic community here, not only in terms of Spanish language literature, but the cultural implications and stigmas that exist. My question is for Dr. Healy in terms of a more kind of broad awareness of students of mental illness. We've talked a lot about the treatment of individuals and support from teachers and counselors, et cetera, but how does this play itself out in terms of making students aware of this in health class? I don't know if that's covered or those kinds of things.
The awareness has targeted parents a great deal and teachers, but you're also right that helping children themselves and teenagers to know about healthy functioning is critical as well. And some of that occurs through what we call classroom guidance, and that means that school counselors go into classrooms and do a psychoeducational teach piece about many, many topics. Some of these topics are prescribed by the Texas Education Agency, and they're things like goal setting and self-confidence development, responsible behavior, et cetera, and cross-cultural effectiveness, interpersonal effectiveness. So we teach children the healthy building blocks of functioning, but I think it's also critically important to help youngsters themselves know what are some of the signs of distress and who do you tell, where do you go. And so we have a 397 SAFE line that individuals can call. We encourage students to come in and talk to their counselor, to talk to their LSSP or social worker, but you make a great point that we need to do a great job, probably a better job, of educating youngsters themselves about the indicators of mental health or mental illness. Thank you.
This conversation is such a wonderful beginning to this. Mm-hmm. It's really great. You have another?
My question is actually for Dr. Healy and for Dr. Von Stultz. We've talked about early childhood screening. And I work with Bexar County on the Mental Health Consortium, and this is something that's of great interest to me. And I'm wondering how we overcome the legislative issues surrounding children to bringing screening into schools, elementary schools and middle schools, because we can't always rely on children and families self-identifying, but we have access to literally thousands of children in schools that would involve this early intervention. But how do we make that happen? We screen for eyes, we screen for hearing, we check for scoliosis, but we don't screen for mental illnesses. And how can we breach that obstacle?
I'd like to address that one. Because we work with minors, and minors are a vulnerable population, we have to be careful that we don't put minors in the hands of non-school professionals for various screenings in the absence of a written parental consent. So that, again, is regulated by federal law. So we can set up screenings that would be in the evenings where parents come with their children, but we couldn't have outside agencies come in and screen children in the absence of a parental consent. That being said, under the Texas Education Code, educators also are not allowed to diagnose. So what we can do is describe functioning to parents and say, your child is more tearful than other students. Your child is less able to engage. He or she can only stay on task 5 minutes as compared to other children. So we can describe functioning and then connect parents with those who can provide screenings, intervention, support. But what we couldn't do is bring in outside agencies to screen children in the absence of parental consent.
And there are challenges. I mean, there is apprehension, I think, in the community, again, related to stigma about what that means to go into a school and screen all children, and that's something a campaign like this may help to kind of overcome, is those challenges. But there are also opportunities to screen school-age children in other areas. You could go have children be screened during their wellness checks with their doctors. So for those of you who are still utilizing pediatricians, think about when you go to your wellness check and what the doctor asks, and do they ask questions either through a checklist or whatever about, you know, mental health type issues in regards to sleeping and behavior, or is all of it about, you know, runny noses and things like that? So it's something you can advocate on a personal basis. You know, why is there not any questions here about kind of more mental health related issues? So
one of the dilemmas with screening is then what do you do once you find it? And for instance, at Clarity, our outpatient, the phones ring constantly, and sometimes it's, you know, 6 weeks before people can get in for an appointment. I mean, it's not like they need more business, you know, in the sense that the system is already, you know, the system that we currently have is kind of filled to the brim. But I would also second what Jeannie's saying, that unfortunately it doesn't, because of those logistical issues with families, we have things like no-show rates, and people don't get the optimal, once they get in, then they don't always get the optimal treatment that we would like them to have. From a legislative standpoint, I think it is important for people to communicate with legislators. The people who have a mental disorder and they're doing well, you know, they've been to therapy, they're taking their medicine, their life is going okay. Because of the stigma, they're not going to be calling up their legislator and saying, you know, I took medicine and I saw my therapist and I'm doing great, I just want you to know that. On the other hand, there are people who, whether it's well-intentioned or not, have the attitude, well, there's too much medication, this is all wasted money and it's wasted time and we don't want the government going in and doing this or that. Those people are very actively calling legislators and creating the perception that there's too much treatment and there need to be more restrictions on treatment. So the legislators really need to hear from the other side, because those same biases that are in the general public are among, you know, many people who hold public office.
And I know, speaking of the legislators, Senator Van de Putte is very likely to be watching this after the fact, since she's frequently takes advantage of being in two places at once and watching NOWCast webcasts after the fact. So feel free to share it with other lawmakers as well. There was another question.
This is really a question for everyone on the panel, I believe. It touches everyone. We've watched in horror the tragedies in Colorado, in Virginia Tech, and at Newtown, and that's elevated the debate about gun control, but also mental health. So my question is, how can this community and all of the stakeholders that we have in this room and others that we could actually get in touch with do something to help avoid those kinds of tragedies through proper mental health care in this area?
I think that's a very good question. I think there's two issues that come up in situations like that. If you look at all of these cases from Aurora, Newtown, et cetera, you usually see a person who had a very severe mental illness. The family may or may not have suspected that something really bad was going on. So the first step is sometimes family members, you know, oh, he sits in his room and he's piling up all this stuff and he tells me he's hearing voices. They may not, because people have gotten, people don't talk about mental illness, they don't necessarily realize that that's an issue. But secondly, they may realize it's an issue and they call up and they can't find any way to get that person into treatment if he or she does not want to go. And you can try to get an emergency detention. They're brought to the emergency room, but once the person gets there and says, no, I'm not hearing voices, I don't want to hurt anybody, I'm not going to I'm not going to kill myself, you know, there's not grounds to do a commitment. And this all has come out of a long range of federal court decisions that began in the 1970s, where it was interpreted that putting someone in a mental hospital is a denial of liberty, and therefore you can only do it if there's this immediate threat of harm to other people. And the moment that immediate threat disappears and the person wants to leave, they have to go. Now, first, you know, we have to change attitudes about that, that getting if someone falls down on the street and they're having a seizure, we rush and help them, and we give them the treatment they need. So if someone's psychotic on the street, it really ought to be the same rule, but that's not the way the law looks at it. So changing public attitudes about that, one, changing the law, on the other hand, is going to be a much more difficult process, because it's been sort of interpreted as part of the Constitution that you can't be forced to get treatment unless you're at an immediate harm, and therefore you either have to amend the United States Constitution, which is no easy task, or you have to gradually have courts say, in the light of new findings about the medical basis of mental illness, perhaps these earlier decisions need to be modified, but it would be a very long process.
The other side, I mean, this is a very complex issue in this country, and that's a vast understatement. I think the challenge you face, say that an individual goes in for some type of treatment, how is that reported to a law enforcement agency, and how is that person suddenly placed on a list where they don't have access to a weapon, or they can't go out and purchase a weapon? Does that necessarily mean that they can't get their hands on a weapon? We have 300 million guns in this country. I'm not going to get into the whole issue of gun control debate, but it's a very complex issue involving privacy issues and federal state laws as to how that information is reported to law enforcement, and how that individual is denied a permit, whether denied the ability to purchase a weapon, or really their whole access to weapons. You can have an individual that could be going through some type of treatment. There could be family members or somebody else where they can break into a home and steal a weapon. So there's still the availability of the weapon itself. So it's a very complex issue, but I would have to say that we must address in this country the whole issue of mental illness associated, whether it's at the early childhood level, but certainly at the adult level.
Dr. Von Stultz, did you want to? No, okay.
No, I just say also in schools we have protocols for school safety. All schools have school safety plans, safety audits. We train counselors and administrators in threat assessment so that we're able to be proactive in school safety, and certainly advocating for more mental health is so key, rather than only things like metal detectors, but advocating that funds be allocated for mental health, because just as all our panelists have said, when an individual is in the community who seems like they may pose a threat to others, many people in the aftermath say, oh, I knew something, I thought something, that person seemed like maybe something was going to happen. And so again, encouraging that individuals come forward and try to get help and support for someone who looks like they may be at risk for perpetrating violence.
Definitely so. We're almost at the point where we have to wrap it up. Is there there's one more?
Here, okay. My question is geared more towards the relatively small percentage of children, but nevertheless present, with more severe disorders, such as the thought disorders, the schizophrenia, bipolar psychosis, that type of thing. And you were talking earlier about the Dr. Pliszka, the effectiveness of treatment for ADHD, depression, and how promising that can be when combined with counseling, behavioral skills training, and so forth. For these children that have the more severe illness, the psychotic early onset, what is the effectiveness of treatment with these children? We know that there's obviously medication, but as far as psychosocial rehabilitation, illness management, how effective do you think that would be to help them be able to improve their own functioning? We see this with adults with vocational rehab and stuff to help them stay in their jobs, but what about the children that are in school, and to help them stay in school and be able to function with these disorders?
Well, I think for kids with severe, say, let's take bipolar as a good example. Generally, the medications are going to be about 2/3 effective in significantly reducing the symptoms, whichever first medicine is used. If then additional medicines need to be added, you get probably another 10–20% get significant improvement. The types of psychosocial interventions, there's a lot of talk therapies that are aimed basically at mood regulation. You know, if the mood swings are reduced by 50% by the medication, that's great, but it may not be sufficient to be functional. So the person needs to kind of learn to be aware of their own moods and sort of govern them themselves. And then, of course, the other arm there for the child is often in school. A lot of those kids are in special ed where they get an aide to help them out. If they're getting upset, they can go to a resource classroom to calm down, or in some cases even be in a special school setting. So it's really a kind of more of a wraparound sort of situation. And the idea is to maintain the environment in a very structured way so that time and will, at least to some degree, heal. And yes, a lot of kids with bipolar disorder do get better as they get older, end up on less medicine. Some tragically do not, and it just evolves into an adult bipolar illness.
Anybody else? No? Okay. Well, that concludes the panel portion of our event today. You've heard about the campaign to end the stigma, and you've heard from a brave mother and a panel of very, very committed professionals. It's up to you to make a difference, and it's pretty simple. Pledge to end the stigma, and you go to oneinfiveminds.org. There is also a oneinfiveminds.org on Facebook, so you can like it, and you can become part of the solution. As Fred said earlier, you're going to get some updates, and you're going to get additional information about things that you can do and things that you can pass along, because you need to be part of the solution. You've heard of what the cost is to this community. There's nothing worse than doing nothing. You need to join these amazing leaders, join Lisa and her family, and end the stigma. Thank you so much for attending today.